Good afternoon. Welcome to Cool Springs. Today is Wednesday, September the 10th, 2025, and this is our series, Heroes and Heroines of the Church, which covers from the end of the New Testament up to all through church history to very, very modern times. Today I want us to focus real briefly on the abolitionist movement, where during America's colonial period, not just in America, but it was in the New World as a whole, slave traders were taking slaves out of primarily the continent of Africa and bringing them to like various Caribbean nations, South America, North America. But also there were people being taken as slaves. You may have heard the term about the Barbary pirates. That was during the 16 and 1700s, where pirate ships, particularly connected with the Ottoman Empire, that was controlling what we would know as Turkey and all of the Holy Land, Lebanon, Syria, the Arabian Peninsula. They were very, very active in taking slaves and using them not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world. You had a group of Christians, Protestant Christians, in Germany. Before Germany became the nation we know as Germany, before it was various Prussian states, that developed an idea of worshiping God, and they formed a group called the Society of Friends. The slang term for them is the Quakers, and I say it is slang term because when the Society of Friends first started, people who were opposed to them used the term Quaker as a slur against them, based on the fact that the people who were members of the Society of Friends had a healthy fear and reverence and respect for God. And so some of the people who were in what we would know today as Germany decided to move to the New World seeking religious freedom, and they settled in Pennsylvania. William Penn had been given a charter by King Charles II of England to have a lot of land west of the colony of New Jersey, and that was supposed to be an area set up for religious freedom. Well, the Society of Friends in Germany met up with some other Christians, Mennonite Christians, in the Netherlands, and they settled, and some of the Mennonites went ahead and joined the Society of Friends, and others kind of worshiped there out of convenience until they could get Mennonite missionaries to come into their area. And one of the things that they had in common was their understanding of the scriptures, particularly out of Leviticus, was that we were to love our neighbors as ourselves, and therefore they took the position that biblically it was not okay for people to enslave other people. Now, some of the people coming to the New World during the colonial period from the 1600s up until the late 1700s were people who were indentured servants, where they had agreed to basically sell themselves as hired hands for a period of time in exchange for passage to the New World, and others were simply being brought over as slaves. So both the Mennonites and the Society of Friends, the Quakers, were people who were early on in the colonies calling out the evil of human slavery. So I took a couple of notes here that I'll pass along to you. In 1688, so that's well before the American Revolution, 1688, a man by the name of Francis Daniel Pastorius, who was a member of the Society of Friends, he was a Quaker, wrote a paper petitioning their governing board of the Society of Friends to speak out publicly, calling for the abolition of slavery. And they kept that document. It was preserved in some historical records, and just within their own denomination, their own church, they were advocating for people to stop using slaves for farmhands or for any other kind of purpose as a moral issue. But it wasn't until 1844, about 150 years later, that they made that document public outside of their denomination and started really encouraging people in the colonies of what now is known as the United States to stop importing slaves from Europe. In 1808, a new law was passed in America that banned the various states from importing new slaves into any of the United States. Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, Section 9, deals with that. A lot of people aren't familiar with it. It allowed them to continue to have slaves in the places that they already had them, but it was actually on the book saying, as a federal law, states, you don't have the right to import slaves. Well, this is well before the Civil War. The Civil War is going to break out in 1861, and this law was passed based on Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution in 1808, but the southern states were ignoring it, and there was a lot of back and forth between not only political figures in the 13 original U.S. states and the states that had been added since then, but it was largely being fueled by religious groups. What the Society of Friends, the Quakers, and the Mennonites had started raising the alarm saying, hey, this is not a godly thing to do, to practice human slavery, was beginning to gain ground. And so you had this period in American history where, particularly in the South, where the agricultural society was economically dependent on having a lot of workers to work the fields. People in the more northern, more industrialized parts of the new nation were saying, yeah, they're right about slavery being evil and against God's will. And so you had things like the Underground Railroad being formed for people to help folks escape from slavery into freedom by moving from the states that allowed slavery and practiced it to free states and on up further into Canada before the start of the Civil War even came about. So the religious people were arguing over whether or not you could support slavery using God's word, or whether or not it was inherently evil, and that was one of the root causes of our American Civil War. The abolitionists were right. Hanging onto a human person in bondage, denying them the basic rights to determine for their own selves where, how they wanted to live, and being free to move about was a basic human freedom. And so the abolitionists, even though it caused the country to go through a time of arguing and separation, and a lot of people died in the Civil War as a result of trying to get it right, they were doing the right thing, and they were calling people into a moral conscience of knowing deeply, what does God's word say? Should we call ourselves followers of Christ if we're willing to take other human beings and treat them like property and deny them the freedoms that we want for ourselves? So the abolitionists are some of the heroes of the church age because they helped call people to live a life that's more in line with what God's word teaches on how we should love our neighbor as ourselves, and therefore give our neighbor the same rights that we want for our own selves. Thanks for watching.